How is the sternum positioned relative to the heart? Anterior, medial, posterior, or inferior? Anterior. The sternum lies in front of the heart, forming the chest's anterior wall. How is the heart positioned relative to the lungs? Inferior, medial, superficial, or lateral? Medial. The heart is positioned between the lungs, closer to the body's midline. How is the skin positioned relative to the muscles? Distal, medial, superficial, or deep? Superficial. The skin is the most external layer of the body. How are the ribs positioned relative to the lungs? Superficial, medial, deep, or distal? Superficial. The ribs form a protective cage around the lungs, closer to the surface. How is the diaphragm positioned relative to the lungs? Medial, anterior, superior, or inferior? Inferior. The diaphragm is a muscle that lies below the lungs, separating the thorax from the abdomen. How is the spine positioned relative to the stomach? Superior, lateral, anterior, or posterior? Posterior. The vertebral column forms the posterior axis of the body. How is the scapula positioned relative to the spine? Medial, lateral, superior, or anterior? Lateral. The scapula is located on the outer, posterior part of the rib cage, away from the midline. How is the heart positioned relative to the sternum? Posterior, anterior, superior, or lateral? Posterior. The heart is located behind the sternum within the thoracic cavity. How are the lungs positioned relative to the heart? Lateral, medial, anterior, or deep? Lateral. The lungs are situated on either side of the heart. How is the liver positioned relative to the diaphragm? Posterior, superior, lateral, or inferior? Inferior. The liver is located in the upper right abdomen, below the diaphragm. How is the stomach positioned relative to the spleen? Superficial, inferior, lateral, or medial? Medial. The stomach is closer to the midline of the body compared to the spleen. How are the muscles positioned relative to the skin? Lateral, deep, proximal, or superficial? Deep. The muscles are internal structures located beneath the skin. How are the kidneys positioned relative to the intestines? Posterior, superficial, lateral, or anterior? Posterior. The kidneys are located behind the peritoneal lining of the abdominal cavity. How are the lungs positioned relative to the ribs? Lateral, superficial, proximal, or deep? Deep. The lungs are internal organs, located deep to the rib cage. How is the urinary bladder positioned relative to the pubic bone? Lateral, superior, anterior, or posterior? Posterior. In a full bladder, it lies posterior and superior to the pubic bone, but posterior is the key relationship. How is the small intestine positioned relative to the large intestine? Posterior, deep, proximal, or distal? Proximal. The small intestine is closer to the start of the digestive tract than the large intestine is. How is the abdominal aorta positioned relative to the inferior vena cava? Left, right, anterior, or superficial? Left. In the abdominal cavity, the aorta runs slightly to the left of the inferior vena cava. How is the pancreas positioned relative to the stomach? Lateral, posterior, superior, or anterior? Posterior. The pancreas is a retroperitoneal organ located behind the stomach. How is the trachea positioned relative to the esophagus in the thorax? Anterior, lateral, posterior, or inferior? Anterior. The trachea is located in front of the esophagus as they descend through the chest. How is the thoracic cavity positioned relative to the abdominopelvic cavity? Posterior, superior, inferior, or medial? Superior. The chest cavity is above the abdominal and pelvic cavities. The heart is located in a smaller cavity within the thoracic cavity called the what? Mediastinum, pericardium, pleura, or peritoneum. Mediastinum. The mediastinum is the central compartment of the thoracic cavity, housing the heart, great vessels, and other structures. How is the pericardium positioned relative to the heart? Medial, lateral, superficial, or deep? Superficial. The pericardium is the protective sac surrounding the heart, making it the outer layer. How is the esophagus positioned relative to the trachea? Inferior, posterior, anterior, or lateral? Posterior. The esophagus runs behind the trachea, throughout the chest and neck. How is the inferior vena cava positioned relative to the abdominal aorta? Right, anterior, left, or posterior? Right. The IVC and aorta run parallel, with the IVC positioned to the right of the aorta. How is the spleen positioned relative to the left kidney? Anterior, medial, inferior, or superior? Superior. The spleen rests on the upper lateral aspect of the left kidney. The gallbladder is located on the what surface of the liver? Posterior, superior, anterior, or inferior? Inferior. The gallbladder is nestled in a fossa on the underside of the liver. How is the pylorus of the stomach positioned relative to the cardia? Posterior, proximal, distal, or inferior? Distal. The pylorus is the stomach's outlet, farther from its start than the fundus is. How is the appendix positioned relative to the cecum? Medial, inferior, deep, or superior? Inferior. The appendix is a blind-ended tube that projects downward from the cecum. How are the adrenal glands positioned relative to the kidneys? Superior, lateral, inferior, or anterior? Superior. The adrenal glands are endocrine organs that sit like caps on top of each kidney. How is the mesentery positioned relative to the small intestine? Medial, anterior, posterior, or lateral? Posterior. The mesentery is a double layer of peritoneum that anchors the small intestine to the posterior abdominal wall.